vegan for 364 days out of the year, but then Halloween arrives. By Spooky Horror.
Space isn't the final frontier. The human body is. One man's curse is another man's pleasure.
On Halloween night 3 years ago, my buddy Mike and I snuck into an abandoned house we found in the woods to get wasted. We soon discovered, though, that the house wasn't abandoned, but home to a frightening old woman whose face was covered in scars and whose tattered black shawl draped nearly to her knees. She barged through the front door just as Mike finished polishing off the last of our 12-pack. After surveying the graveyard of crushed beer cans littering the floor, she flashed us such a look of disdain that it froze the marrow in my bones.
"You little devils,"
she said, voice hushed but powerful.
"You little serpents."
Mike and I looked at her in stunned silence, too frightened to move. The only sound in the house was the crackling of the fire we had started in the dilapidated fireplace. "We're sorry, ma'am," I eventually said. "We thought this house was abandoned. We'll clean up this mess and get out of here." She ignored me and instead took an aggressive step into the living room.
"You teenagers never learn. You think you can break into old Agatha's house whenever you want and trash the place. Your tomfoolery never ends. All of you are serpents, and desperately in need of punishment."
Please don't call the police," said Mike. "We'll get out of your hair, miss, I promise. We're sorry for interrupting your night."
"The police?"
She beamed at him, revealing a jagged row of crooked yellow teeth.
"You don't have to worry about them. I've got something else in store for both of you. Something more fitting for the serpents that you truly are."
Before Mike and I had a chance to respond or hightail it out of the back door, she started chanting in a language I had never heard before. Each word that poured out of her mouth sounded more sinister than the last and echoed around the house in an ear-splitting cacophony. Just as I feared that my eardrums might burst, her chanting stopped and an eerie silence descended over the room. I tried to shift my legs, but they were frozen to the ground. It was as if a pair of invisible fingers had risen up through the floor and wrapped around my calves in a vice grip. "What did you do to us?" I said, my voice breathless.
"I placed a curse on you. One fitting for pesky children who love to stick their noses where they shouldn't."
"Curse?" said Mike. "What do you mean, curse?"
"Every Halloween from midnight till dawn, you will be forced to wander the town's sewers, naked, on your bellies, hunting rats and eating them raw." She paused a moment, black eyes stroking our frozen flesh. "If you are going to act like serpents, then serpents you shall be."
3 hours later, Mike and I were slithering through the sewers, eating rats, just like she said. Our bodies were not our own during that time. An invincible force propelled our limbs, similar to the one that had rooted us to the floor in Agatha's house. Words cannot describe the horrors of that night. I'm vegan, so each rat I consumed made me retch so violently I feared I might vomit up my entire stomach. No matter how hard I tried to empty my body of such vile flesh, though, my possessed hands would locate another rat and force even more tainted meat and blood into my already bloated belly. Every Halloween night since then, Mike and I have been forced to endure this demented marathon. Our bellies are permanently scarred from the scrapes and concrete burns, and our taste buds are irreparably changed. What frightens me most, though, is that last year I discovered Mike had grown to enjoy our excursions. The sewer was already filled with rat carcasses that Halloween, long before the stroke of midnight fell and our curse propelled us beneath the city. Yes, Mike began early, and my gut tells me that our city hasn't been rat-free ever since, because of the local exterminator.
Johnny, the cold voice whispered. Her words were getting more and more raspy, starting to sound as if she'd smoked 2 packs a day since we'd been kids. Yes, Ellen. There was a pause. You know my one regret, Johnny? She'd been dead for going on 6 months, yet, considering the circumstances, she still smelled delightfully well. I had a hunch she kept a bottle of old perfume down there with her. No. What is it? An audible sigh could be heard from underneath my bed. Oh, I just wish we would have had kids, you know? Terror gripped me then, for more reason than one. I thought over my most strategic answer, as not to anger the dangerous thing that watched over me as I slept. Yeah, me too, I mumbled. Do you mean that? She asked, popping her head out from under the bed and nearly giving me a heart attack in the process. Jesus, I screamed, jumping back against the wall. There was a single, plump worm in her left eyeball now, looking to have fed happily since her untimely demise. She growled then, baring her teeth, which were unusually sharp, and hissing before floating back out of sight and into the darkness. You're such an... Do I really look that bad? I paused, then recovered. No, not at all, honey. It's just the worm caught me by surprise, that's all. She sighed again. I know I don't look so good, she replied, consciously forcing herself to stop growling madly. But love is love, right? That made me think back to the first night I'd seen her. I thought I was dreaming as I watched the fresh corpse of my girlfriend gently push open the window. She kissed me on the cheek and slunk under my bed. I don't want you to see me like this, she'd said. Not without my makeup. My thoughts now in the present again, I sighed. She'd looked so much better back then, when she was only freshly dead. Johnny, I've been thinking. I'm not getting any more alive, you know, and I think my lady parts are still intact. I interrupted. Ellen, honey, you're f***ing dead. Since when has that ever stopped anyone? She replied indignantly. She slid back across the floor, her red eyes starting to glow as they looked into mine. Look, all I'm saying is, I want us to try. I began to make my argument against it when she continued. Johnny, I'm not stupid. I know you've got options. I see the way that little Susie's still alive looks at you. It was true. Susie had the hots for me, and I was ashamed to say I'd thought about asking her out for coffee since Ellen had died. It'd be nice to have a girlfriend that liked going places, well, other than beneath my bed, and sometimes in my closet. Ellen, it's just... Terror washed over me then, and I remember that whatever my girlfriend was turning into, I couldn't talk to her honestly like I'd used to. There, would be consequences. Johnny, she continued, her voice becoming calm and demonic as her red eyes glowed more brightly. You either try and give me a baby, or one of these nights, you'll find yourself underneath this bed with me.
Don't go into the woods this Halloween by Striker the Gecko.
You know that lecture your parents give you every year on October 31st? You know the one. Don't go into strangers' houses. Don't eat opened candy. Don't go into someone's car. Don't leave the street. You probably rolled your eyes or swore under your breath, but it is good advice. Unfortunately, last year, I didn't follow the rules, and now you and everybody is in danger. Now, let me explain. It all started last year on Halloween night. Halloween, if you don't know, is my favorite holiday. I love a good scare. So, me and my friends, David, Kyle, and Tom, we were 14, so trick-or-treating wasn't exciting enough anymore. Kyle wanted to go to Hannah Jenner's party, but her parents asked some neighbors to watch the party and make sure things didn't get out of hand. So it was boring, and we left after a few minutes. We started walking down the street, hoping for something to do. We decided we could go to Tom's house and play some video games. But now it was about 11:15 at night. When we got to Tom's street, we noticed a car pull up next to his house. David's older brother and some of his friends got out of the car. "What are you doing down here, Jaden?" David asked. "Having some fun," Jaden replied. Jaden's friend took something out of the car. It was a carton of eggs. They started to throw eggs at the house. Then they started egging Tom's house too. Tom demanded they stop, but that just made them do it more. Tom, of course, got mad and started chasing Jaden and his friends. The rest of us began chasing them too. We chased them for a few minutes, and they ran into what I think was the backyard of one of Jaden's friends. The backyard was next to the woods. Jaden ran into the woods, and his friends followed. We kept chasing them. We ran through the woods. We eventually lost them in the dark. "What do we do now?" Kyle asked. "Let's hang out here," Tom said. "Let's not," David whispered. "This place is creepy." "Oh, don't be such a scaredy cat," Tom taunted. "We can use our phone flashlights so we can see." David looked at me, a pleading look on his eyes. I just shrugged. David was a year younger than us and much smarter. He probably knew how dumb this was, but we convinced him to stay. We started joking and laughing as we walked through the woods. We were talking about school when we saw a faint light in the distance. As we got closer, we saw that it was a campfire. We were confused, as this wasn't a campground, and there were no tents or people nearby. We got even closer. We saw a piece of paper lying near the fire. It was simply an arrow pointing due north. That's when we noticed a trail. We decided to follow it. After about 2 minutes of walking, we found something. At the end of the trail was an old, seemingly abandoned house. "I don't like this," David whispered. But we kept on going and walked inside. To this day, I don't understand why we did that. When we entered the house, we saw 2 staircases, one going up and the other down. On the staircase leading to the basement, there was an arrow pointing downward, leading into it. "Let's leave now," David yelled. "Yeah, this is stupid," I replied. That's when we heard the door slam shut. Kyle tried to open it, but it was locked. Tom went upstairs to find a window. Nobody wanted to go downstairs. But after not finding anything, Tom walked downstairs after a few seconds. "No windows," Tom said. "What do you mean?" David was panicking now. "There has to be windows, right?" "I don't know what to tell you, but there's nothing here," Tom yelled. Kyle tried to calm us down, but David was screaming for help and crying and screaming that we were going to die. David's fears made us all scared, and we began yelling too for help. That's when we heard the sound of footsteps walking down the staircase leading to the top floor. It was coming right towards us. We ran downstairs. When we got there, we found a large room with candles lit and a book on a small empty desk. However, on the floor was horrifying. There were 3 corpses lying there. It was Jaden and 2 of his friends. Tom began screaming. That's when the door on the other side of the room opened. It was an old woman of all people. She smiled and told us to sit down. Oddly, there were chairs near the middle of the room for all of us. We decided to listen and sat down. The woman began to speak.
"I love it when I have visitors.
Her voice was weak and raspy.
Please enjoy your stay. Oh, I almost forgot. Rufus, come down, boy."
Rufus walked down the stairs, but it wasn't a dog. It was a large man with extremely long hair over his shoulders. He didn't speak. He just grunted.
"Please let me read you a story. My visitors always love a good story."
She walked to the desk where the candles were and picked up the book that was lying on it. She began to read from it.
"If you wish to summon Dagdramak, the spirit of All Hallows Eve, then you must find 6 people and sacrifice them to the great Dagdramak. You must do this every Hallowed Eve for 13 years, and then Dagdramak will rise."
She looked at us and smiled.
"This is my 12th year, friends. I'm sorry you have to go soon, but I must summon Dagdramak."
Rufus threw Kyle to the ground and then tied the rest of us to our chairs. He grabbed Kyle. The old woman began to chant something, but I couldn't make out what she said. We watched in horror as Rufus killed Kyle. He threw the corpse into the pile. We all screamed as Rufus grabbed Tom then, and the woman recited the chant. Rufus killed Tom. The same happened to David. After that, the woman looked at me and frowned. She had gotten 6 people, and I don't think she could go over.
"Listen to me now, boy,"
the woman yelled in a surprisingly deep voice.
"If you tell anyone about this, you will die. You hear me?"
Okay, I said. I was still terrified. That's when I passed out. I woke up in the backyard that bordered the woods. I walked to the street, and that's when a police car happened to drive up next to me. He told me that my parents had been looking for me for hours and asked me what happened. I began to tell him, but I felt lightheaded and fainted again. I awoke in a hospital room. I had passed out and gotten a concussion. I was questioned by the police and by my parents about what happened, but I just told them I didn't know. I was too afraid of what would happen if I told them. However, last week, I found a way to cheat the spell. It doesn't work if I write or type what had happened. I'm telling you this to warn you. Do not enter the woods this Halloween. If you do, then that witch will summon Dagdramak again. I don't know what will happen if he is summoned, but I don't want to find out.
I witnessed my son do something terrible on Halloween. I have a confession to make. I've been trying so hard to forget what I saw, but now that Halloween is right around the corner again, all these memories resurfaced all of a sudden. I now know it was wrong to keep my mouth shut. But before I tell my husband about it, and later on the authorities, I want to get it off my chest anonymously. Maybe this will help me confessing to my loved ones. My son, I'll call him Al for the sake of the story, is crazy about Halloween. Each year, he dresses up as a zombie. Al loves zombies. Last year, he begged and pleaded with me to let him go trick-or-treating with his friends. I used to always come along, but that year, he wanted to go without adult supervision. Just him and his buddies. He was 10 years old at the time and pretty mature already. I was reluctant at first, but after thinking it over for a while, I approved. We live in a friendly, rural neighborhood bordering on large cornfields. Everyone knows everyone. I figured that they would be fine. The kid needed his freedom after all. Plus, his friend Amy would come along as well. She was 12 years old already and always reminded her younger friends to behave. However, one last glimpse of uncertainty within me caused me to decide that I would sneakily follow them to keep an eye on Al from a distance without bothering him, just to be absolutely safe. I did as planned, and on Hallows Eve, I let my son put on his costume and painted him some spooky zombie makeup, complete with sprinkles of fresh blood on his ripped clothing and smears of it around his mouth. He took a look into the mirror and let out a squeal of delight. He hugged me, grabbed his little bag, rushed outside. I waited a bit before going outside myself. His father wasn't home that night, so I left a bowl of candy on the front porch in hopes of it not being raided immediately. Upon walking out the door, I saw Al run towards a small group of other kids in fancy costumes. I recognized them all. There was Amy in her witch costume, our neighbor's son Mark was a vampire, and there was a ghost whom I could only assume was Al's best friend Blake. I smiled at the sweet sight. It was always the four of them. I followed them at a safe distance, trying not to catch their attention. I watched as they rang at the doors of several houses on their harvest, growing more and more cheerful the more candy they received. It was obvious that Amy wasn't too fond of Al's costume, though. From time to time, my son would scare her by jumping in front of her all of a sudden or making creepy sounds. Amy would shriek loudly every single time before bursting out into laughter. At some point along the way, they began developing Al's zombie scares into a full-on game of catch, my son merrily chasing around the others who, happily giggling, tried to avoid him. It was adorable to watch them play. I knew they weren't little anymore, but it still warmed my heart. They'd reached the end of the main road and were still playing catch. They were enjoying themselves, and I was content, until Amy suddenly ran off into the cornfield to the side of the road. Al, Mark, and Blake followed her, howling like little monsters along the way. I was taken aback. The cornfields were large, and children, or rather residents of our neighborhood in general, were forbidden from entering it. Not because they would trample down the corn, but because people had gotten lost in there before. I couldn't help but instantly get worried. I hurried to run after them, but seeing as I was in pretty bad shape, it took me a while to find them. When I finally caught up with them, I found that they had gathered at the side of the field. Amy was still chuckling, but completely out of breath. "Give me a second, you guys," she panted. "Aw, come on," Blake argued from under his white cloak. Playing zombie is so much fun, Al cheered. In the heat of the game, he had completely given up on his usual calm demeanor and was losing himself in a fit of giggles. Can we keep playing zombie? Please? Yeah, just give me a second, guys, Amy repeated. She was still bent over trying to catch her breath. Suddenly, the three boys stuck their heads together and began murmuring something amongst themselves, out of earshot from Amy. What? What are you talking about? The young girl asked. We're playing zombie for real this time, my son exclaimed. I frowned in confusion, but stayed where I was. I watched as Blake and Mark strode towards Amy and grabbed her by the arms. It's okay. They're just trying to scare her again, I told myself. But that notion was quickly knocked out of me when Al suddenly picked up a large stone from the dusty ground, his skinny arm struggling to lift the heavy thing. Slowly, in a pace almost menacing, he made his way over to Amy. I wanted to intervene. I wanted to dash out of my hiding spot and stop him, tear that rock out of his hands. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed. Tears began welling up in my eyes and running down my cheeks as my mouth dropped open, trying to form sounds to somehow produce the shriek I was hoping for, but to no avail. I tried to move. I tried so hard, but I just couldn't. My body didn't obey me. I watched in horror as my son lifted the rock above his head and brought it down on the screaming, struggling girl's head. He did it again, then again, then again. My son, my child, my flesh and blood bashed his friend's skull in. Blood was gushing everywhere, onto my son's hands, his face, his costume. Al let go of the stone and knelt down and fumbled around in the remains of Amy's head. I felt the vomit rise in my throat when I realized what he was doing. I remained paralyzed with fear, terror, and disgust as my son carefully picked at the bloodied, gory mess and slowly led bits of Amy's brains to his mouth. One by one, they vanished in between his lips like trick-or-treat candy. I didn't stay to watch Mark and Blake join him. When I finally regained control over my body, I simply turned and ran. I ran all the way back home, tears of shock still gushing out of my eyes. I barely made it into the bathroom before I started vomiting. When Al came home later that evening, I didn't come out to greet him. I wouldn't have dared to look into his eyes. I wouldn't have been able to. I haven't been able to look at him the same way ever since. I don't know why he did such a thing. Was it my fault? Where did I go wrong? How did my sweet little boy turn into a monster? I've pretended that everything was fine for almost a whole year now. Every time I would run into Mark's or Blake's parents on my way around town, every time I would pick up my son from school, I pretended I never saw what I saw. They found Amy's corpse the day after Halloween. The police never found out who had done it. Otherwise, I wouldn't be writing this right now. No suspects were ever arrested either. When they questioned my son, he lied through his teeth. Amy's parents moved away not long after. They couldn't stand being in that home in which they'd made so many memories with their daughter. I know I should have told the police, and I hate myself for being too weak to do the right thing. I was scared of my own son, but at the same time, scared of losing him too. I hate myself for not helping Amy. I don't know why I was unable to move, but had I been able to, if I could trade my life for hers, she would be standing here right now. I wish Halloween 2018 had never happened. It has left my son a killer, a sweet young girl dead, and me, a guilt-stricken shell of my former self. I'm not stupid. I know that withholding information from the police in a case of child murder has severe legal consequences. I deserve everything that's coming to me, but so does he. I guess I thought telling the truth wouldn't make a difference. it wouldn't bring Amy back to life. But by now, I know that those were just the cowardly, foolish thoughts of a cowardly and foolish woman. I know it's way too late, but for once, I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to use the blood-stained costume as evidence. I never disposed of it. They're going to figure out which stains are Amy's and which are fake blood, all right. I'm going to name Mark and Blake too. No more Halloween. No more playing zombie.
I went on a meditation retreat in Colorado, but now I would rather die than reach enlightenment. By spooky horror.
To those of you who prey on religious innocence, I hope you rot in whatever hell you believe in the least. How hard is it to let loving, faithful souls like me live their lives in peace?
The two men who ruined my life told me they were lamas. Although I had never heard of any lamas practicing their faith outside of my monastery, I took their word for it. They looked like Tibetans after all, and wore the flowing red robes of Buddhist monks. Our first meeting occurred at a park. This meeting was so inspiring that I could have never imagined the horrors that were soon to follow. We didn't talk long before we got down to business. "Tell me more about this cave," I said. "It is sacred among American Buddhists," said Tenzin. "Not many people know about it. Most lamas keep it a secret to preserve its holiness, just like the historic meditation caves in the Himalayas. It's considered a great honor to meditate there. Typically only practitioners with a high attainment are allowed to visit it." Tenzin was the leader of the two. He had the calm eyes and soothing voice of a meditation master. How he was able to so successfully imitate the demeanor of a lama, I am unsure of to this day. All I know is that people a lot less naive than me have fallen into his trap. "I've been wanting to go on a meditation retreat ever since I was a kid," I said. "Why are you revealing this secret to me, though? I'm not a monk. That alone should prevent me from visiting such a sacred place." Tenzin placed his arm around my shoulders and pulled me towards him until I was no more than a foot away from his face. No respectable lama would ever perform such an aggressive gesture, but I was too enthralled at the prospects of visiting the cave to notice this slip-up in his otherwise impeccable act. "That's the mindset we are trying to break, Daniel," said Tenzin. "If compassion is truly at the heart of the Buddha's teachings, then why do lamas prevent lay practitioners like yourself from meditating in the holiest of locations? Shouldn't everyone be allowed to visit those spots, regardless of their attainment? That's what Champa and I think. Why did you approach me, though? You could have picked anybody walking out of the monastery yesterday. What makes me deserving of such a gift?" Tenzin pulled me in even closer. "We picked you because we can see your potential. Not everyone is destined to reach enlightenment, but with the right training and experience, you are one of those people." "He's right," said Champa. His soft voice drifted over my shoulder like the breeze twirling down from the leaves above our heads. "We can sense your wisdom and compassion. Enlightenment is a rare gift, and one that you will be able to achieve with the right training. Come with us to Colorado, and we will teach you everything you need to know." 1 week later, I found myself piled into the back of Tenzin's car. My desire to go on my first meditation retreat compelled me to cling onto his tales of enlightenment like a starving dog does on a bone. The thought that somebody as normal as me had the potential to reach nirvana filled my soul with bliss. I didn't sleep the night before we left, despite my best efforts. Visions of the cave that I would soon be meditating in consumed my waking eyes and morphed the vaulted ceilings of my bedroom into the snowy slopes of the Rocky Mountains. We arrived at the cave after a lengthy hike around 3 the next day. The moment we reached its mouth, Tenzin placed his arm around my shoulders. "Rejoice, Daniel," he said. "You are about to enter the most sacred meditation cave in America. More llamas have reached enlightenment leaning against those beautiful walls than I care to count." His eyes widened as they drank in the beautiful scene in front of me. The cave undulated into the cliffside in spherical perfection. Bright minerals dotted the rocky walls in checker-like patterns and reflected flashes of blue and white every time our bodies shifted and changed the spread of sunlight pouring in through the entrance. "It's beautiful," I said. I followed Tenzin and Champa into the cave. Our footsteps echoed as we walked. Rather than pause near the cave's entrance like I thought we were going to do, my companions led me deeper into the mountain. I followed them silently for over a minute before speaking up. "Why are we going so deep into the cave?" I said. "I thought that we were going to meditate near the entrance. I can barely see." "You will see soon enough," said Tenzin. "Practice your mindfulness, and we will reach our destination before you know it." I opened my mouth to respond, but then decided to keep my protests to myself. I was in no position to question Tenzin. He was doing me a favor after all. No other llama I knew would go through so much trouble to take me on a meditation retreat. Eventually, though, the darkness became so absolute that I began to panic. I don't want to go any further," I said, voice rushed. "I can't see." "Don't worry, Daniel," said Champa. "We're here." Before I could ask him what he meant, I heard the swinging open of a door, followed by the shrieks of an indeterminable number of voices. These voices were laced with the tremors of insanity and startled me so badly that I went stumbling into Champa, who had somehow maneuvered behind me. I yelped as he wrapped his arms around my chest and hoisted me into the room. The cries echoing around the chamber assaulted my ears with dagger-like stabs. I tried to break free of Champa's grip, but it was no use. The man was deceptively strong. A few moments later, Tenzin lit a torch and illuminated the most frightening scene I had ever seen. 3 men and 2 women were bound, gagged, and leaning against the walls of the chamber. They were filthy and emaciated. I could tell that they had been held captive for weeks, if not months. Their clothes clung to their bodies in tatters, and such a horrible stench filled the room that I almost started retching. I trembled as Tenzin approached me, brandishing a blindfold and secured it around my head. This blindfold was soon followed by a pair of thick ropes, which he used to immobilize my limbs. "It's done," said Tenzin. He forced me to the wall that housed the other captives. "We now can finally complete the ritual." "Let us rejoice," said Champa. They started bleating like horses, bawling like goats, and screaming like donkeys, the sounds of which echoed around the chamber in an ear-deafening cacophony. These animalistic shrieks frightened me so badly that I soon lost consciousness. When I came to an indeterminable amount of time later, the sound of chanting voices filled my ears. These voices were coming from all sides of me, and sounded so evil that for a moment I thought I had died and regained consciousness in the pits of hell. Then I remembered the events that had happened earlier in the day and almost wished that I had. Somewhere to my left, I could hear the sound of something boiling. Whatever was causing the sound, it certainly wasn't water. Although I'm no expert in the kitchen, I have cooked enough pasta in my time to know what boiling water sounds like. The sound filling my ears gurgled and hissed unlike water, which lightly rumbles. Every time the cadences of the voices changed, or the volume increased or decreased, the sound of the boiling liquid morphed, like an old radio trying its hardest to tune itself to a hard-to-reach radio wave. The noises emanating from the mixture were so responsive and so thick. I can't think of any other words to describe the intoxicating effect it had on the surrounding air, that I believed the liquid to be a living entity. Although I knew this shouldn't be possible, I tried to tell myself not to let my mind succumb to such nonsense. But the sound of it sloshing was so organic that it had to be alive. The sound of the guttural voices spinning around me made it nearly impossible to think. Even if I could think clearly, though, I doubted that I actually could develop a plan of escape from the chamber. My bonds were tied too tightly for one thing. I could already feel bruises forming on my wrists and ankles, and I was outnumbered for another. The only way I was going to escape was if my captors let me escape. Given that this was just about as likely to happen as me conjuring a knife in my hand from thin air, it looked like I wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. Despite this realization, I remained remarkably calm. My heart pulsed its standard 90 beats per minute, and my limbs laid relaxed by their sides. Based on my demeanor, someone might have thought I had given up hope, that I had accepted my fate and was ready to die. In reality, though, that couldn't have been farther from the truth. I wanted to live, and live for a long time. A long time. For this reason, my calmness wasn't really a calmness at all, but a heightened form of waiting. What was I waiting for? Well, I didn't really know. All I knew was that I was going to punish these jerks the moment I got the chance for ever laying a hand on me. "The time has come," said Tenzin. The chanting stopped, and the echoes of these final shrieks jarred my ears like nails dragging across a chalkboard. "Champa," he continued, "test them." I heard footsteps somewhere to my left, and then heard a man start to whimper as he was hoisted to his feet. The sound of his frightened sniffling juxtaposed heavily with the guttural chants that had only moments ago filled the room, heightening the bizarreness of the situation. I listened in horror as his helpless body was dragged over to the boiling liquid. Never before had skin being dragged across stone produced such a terrifying sound. His very soul sounded like it was being yanked across the chamber, doing its best to use friction as its final defense before it was tossed forever into the streaming pits of hell. "Don't you touch him, you bastards!" shouted a woman through her gag. Based on the proximity of her voice, I thought that she was lying somewhere along the wall to my right. I heard the dull thud of a boot meeting flesh, and then cringed as the air left her lungs. "Speak again and I will slit your throat," said Tenzin. Now the man was only inches from the cauldron, the liquid starting to boil faster, as if it were a stomach anticipating its favorite meal. It gurgled and sputtered and spurted like blood coursing through hydraulic veins, and I listened in horror as he was lifted to his feet at its precipice. "Lower him." This command sent the man tumbling into a frenzy. He began to scream like his vocal cords were on fire and thrashed against the ropes binding his limbs. The sound of his struggles caused the woman to go hysterical. She started screaming and thrashing, and only stilled when Champa's knife found her throat a few moments later and sent her screams tumbling out of the open wound in her neck. The sound of her drowning in her own blood mixed with the man's frenzied whimpers and the boiling liquid, which created such a terrifying noise that it made the animalistic chants that had once filled the room sound like Mozart. Although the sound of the woman bleeding out on the floor was enough to break my calmness, the slurping noise the liquid made as the man's head passed through its surface shattered it into oblivion. I imagined his face being scalded as the liquid wrapped its boiling tendrils around his skin, and prayed that his eyes had been closed. The moment his head made contact with the liquid, a hissing sound filled the chamber, followed by a smoke so thick it irritated my nose. I imagined tiny particles of his skin hitching a ride in the smoke and nearly gagged. "Raise him," said Tenzin. The liquid sloshed as the man's head was freed from its grasp. "His flesh remains. He has been accepted." The man's body tumbled to the floor beside me. I couldn't yet tell if he was alive or dead, or how badly the liquid had maimed his face. "Raise him." A pair of arms wrapped around my waist and raised me into the air before I had even time to move. Fear gripped my heart as I was half dragged, half carried towards the lip of the cauldron. But I refused to scream. I didn't want to give these freaks the satisfaction of watching me break. I shut my eyes, held my breath, and winced as my head was plunged into the liquid. Its rancid smell dominated my senses. Much to my surprise, the liquid wasn't hot but frigid, despite the flame raging beneath its iron belly. I shuddered as the liquid crawled all over my face and plastered itself to my skin, as if it were trying to make a mold of my flesh. Even in my panic state, I could sense that the liquid liked me. There was something about my features that sent it spiraling into a pleasured frenzy. Its tendrils were the fingers of a lover, caressing my cheeks in an embrace of tender bliss. I had never felt more violated in my life. Then, suddenly and without warning, my head was lifted out of the liquid, and less than a second later, my body was back on the floor. That my face was dry and pain-free shocked me even more than the billowing tendrils that had been stroking my skin only moments ago. "His flesh remains. He has been accepted. We have what we need. Kill the others." I cringed as I heard the sound of Champa's knife slicing through skin, leaving only me and the other man whose face had been plunged into the cauldron alive. "Fall on your knees and give thanks." Before I had time to process what was happening, I heard the sound of 2 pairs of knees striking the floor at once. Tenzin and Champa had supplicated themselves in front of the cauldron, as if it were the god of the earth. A half-dozen animal sounds then filled the air and sent chills rippling down my spine. These sounds were even more guttural than chants, and echoed around the chamber with such volume that I feared my eardrums might burst. A few moments later, a boot struck my temple and tumbled me into oblivion. When I awoke, it was dark, and I was sprawled on the steps of my monastery. How I had arrived there, I don't know. Tenzin and Champa must have transported me back down the mountain while I was unconscious. I felt something coarse in my hand. I looked down and frowned when I saw a piece of paper nestled between my fingers. After taking a few moments to blink the fog from my eyes, I unfurled this paper and read its contents, which were barely visible by the light of the moon. "Rejoice, Daniel. You have been enlightened. Your journey is just beginning. We will return soon."
The pet I always wanted by Insomnia Storyteller. I've always wanted a puppy, particularly a chocolate lab. I want a friend to follow me, to chase every stick I throw and bring it back like the trusty sidekick he is. I would name him Charlie, and he would be my best friend.
Other kids in my 3rd grade class always bring in pictures of their dogs to show and tell. I remember Abby even got her mom to bring her dog to school on her day to share. Everyone looked at her with such excitement. Abby was the most popular girl in class that week, and while I too reveled in the excitement of the sweet puppy that was romping around the carpet, something deep inside me was furiously envious of her. That day, I went home and begged my mom for a dog. I told her I would take care of it. I would make sure to feed it and wash it and take it for walks. It didn't even have to be a chocolate lab like my dream. I would take any mutt off the street, flea-ridden or 3-legged, I didn't care. My mother sighed, shaking her head in the fashion I had grown to know meant no. I sulked away to my room, defeated and dogless. On my walk home from school about a week later, I noticed a dog crate outside a house on my route. A handwritten sign on it said "Free" in jagged red handwriting. I knew I had to bring it home for my future dog. It would show Mom how responsible I was and how I could take care of a dog. I had found a crate for it, and in my childish mind I thought this would make it so much easier for her to give in to my pleas. When I dragged the crate through the kitchen door, my mother appeared before me, very angrily standing with her hands on her hips.
"What do you think you're doing?"
she asked.
"I told you no dog. Where did you even get that thing anyways?"
I explained to her where I found it and how resourceful I was in doing so.
"Take the thing back to their house. Let someone else who needs it take it. I told you no dogs."
With that, she turned on her heels and went to sit on the couch. I dragged the crate outside, but didn't fully listen to my mother. I pulled it across the porch, down the stairs into the backyard. I opened up the large bulkhead that led out to our scarcely used basement and put the crate down there. One day I would have a dog, and my mother would be so happy I was smart enough to save the crate. Weeks went by, and my pestering only continued. Then, one incredible day, my mother and father sat me down. My mother began speaking, and I could hardly contain my excitement as I listened to her say,
"Remember how you really, really wanted a puppy, Sam? Sam, we're going to have a baby brother very soon. Isn't that exciting? You can think of him as your new puppy,"
she said with a chuckle and a smile. I stared at her and hoped she could see the betrayal I felt. I didn't want a brother. I wanted a dog. How could she think the two were even remotely the same? Stupid parents. I ran out of the room, tears falling down my face. Not from sadness, but more from anger and frustration. I continued the next few months avoiding my parents as much as possible. I would come home and run to my room, drawing picture after picture of my dream dog, Charlie. I could picture him so well. His chocolate brown fur was so dark and rich-looking, and his eyes were so pure and sweet. My walls filled with pictures of this dog, and I began collecting supplies for him. I would get him one way or another, and I was slowly starting to save my money up. I would keep my lunch money and go hungry instead, saving enough for a collar and leash, and then began to save to buy the puppy itself. My parents, too preoccupied with the newborn baby James that I guess my mother had finally plopped out, didn't seem to notice. Their attention was never on me, and always on my new brother. But I was okay with that. It gave me time to prepare my puppy supplies in the basement, waiting for the day until I had enough built up to bring Charlie home. On the day I finally decided I would have my dog, I woke up to my mother screaming. I ran over to see what had upset her and found her on the floor with my father holding her.
Where could he have gone?
She cried.
He can't even walk yet, Anthony. Where in the hell could he have gone?
Neither of them noticed my presence in the hallway, and I walked to the kitchen and poured myself some cereal. I ate it hungrily before going to my room, and grabbing a bundle of blankets to set up my dog crate, stepped outside and walked back to the bulkhead. I opened it and stepped down the concrete stairs, blankets in hand. I took the blanket off the top to reveal my sweet, sweet puppy. Sure, he wasn't exactly what I pictured. His fur wasn't as dark or fluffy as I had hoped. In fact, he didn't have any fur at all. His little thumb was in his mouth, sucking away while his blue eyes looked up at me with admiration. I finally had my puppy. I placed the collar around his neck, the shiny metal tag gleaming up at me with the name Charlie etched into it. I placed my puppy in the crate with the blankets I had set up and locked it. It would be a while before my puppy could walk or catch a stick, but I knew at last I finally had a friend. That was all mine.
If you ever see black-eyed children, please don't make the same mistake that I did. By Lighthouse Horror.
In October of last year, I saw the black-eyed children for the first time. They floated outside the open window, their skin a pale white, and their eyes as dark and void as the deepest hole you can imagine. I had become lost in those eyes. Have you ever had a nightmare you can't remember? I awoke abruptly, covered in sweat, and my heart beating faster than it had ever before. Yet I couldn't recall the things going on in my mind that had shaken me so thoroughly. Sitting up at the edge of my bed, I stared over at my 8-year-old son. "Ben, monsters aren't real. There's nothing to be afraid of," I had said night after night with little result. But that wasn't true, was it? There was plenty to be afraid of. Since his mother had died, each night had progressed the same. I would tuck him in, Ben would promise me that he would stay in his own room tonight, and I would kiss him on the forehead. I then walked tiredly to my own bedroom, closed the door quietly, took more than my own fair share of melatonin, and drifted off to sleep. Upon awakening, I would most certainly find my son gently nestled against my shoulder. Thinking it to be the natural result of losing his mother, I hadn't thought of it much. That was until the nightmares started, and the children began their nightly visit. The first night I saw them, I was sure it had been a dream. The bed was nearly pressed up against the window, and my son was directly below it. The two children reached their arms through the opening and were only inches away from grabbing my son. Somehow holding back a scream, I reached out to push the cold arms away, and then I shut the window and locked it with a loud click.
"Dad,"
Ben had said, having perhaps awoken from his own nightmare. Before he could see the children, I quickly closed the curtains and pressed my back up against the window.
"What are you doing, Dad?"
he continued. "Nothing. Go back to sleep," I said quietly, having no idea what to say or do. This was what I did do. Each night, I would lock the windows securely and shut the blinds so tightly that it was impossible to see anything. I made it a rule in our house that each night every window must be locked securely and the blinds shut. I think I made up some excuse about burglars choosing houses where they could see inside. A few nights later, I peeked through the blinds and saw the 2 children, pale as death, back to where they had been the first night. I became lost in the depth of their eyes, and I watched as they looked from me to my son.
No, you can't have him,
I whispered angrily, snapping back into reality and pushing the blinds closed. As time continued, Ben's nightmares increased.
Dad, sometimes at night I see things,
Ben said, fear washing all over his face. I interrupted quickly. I know what you see, Ben, and don't worry. They can't get you. He began to cry as he looked up at me.
You promise?
Tears flowed down my cheeks then as well, and I hugged him close. I promise. Embracing him tightly, I looked over his shoulder and towards the tightly shut window. I couldn't see the dead children, but I still knew they were out there. Perhaps there were even more than the night before. Months went by, and Ben eventually got to the point where he wanted to try sleeping in his own room again.
I don't want to be afraid anymore, Dad.
He paused and looked up at me.
They can't get me, right?
I was lost for words, trying to hide the fact that I was indeed thinking it over. I had not only boarded off my son's bedroom window, but had sealed it as well. Nothing could get through. I was sure of it. And it wasn't right to have my son always living in fear. Okay, Ben, I said. Shortly after, I set up a live camera in the corner of his room, facing his bed where the window had been. I wanted my son to find courage and face his fears, but I didn't want to take any chances either. I tested the camera feed carefully and then went to tuck him in. Kissing him on the forehead, my son hugged me close.
Don't worry, Dad. I'm not afraid anymore,
he said. I was beyond proud of my son. Not only had he lost his mother, he had been given real monsters to contend with, and he had shown courage and determination in the face of it all. I'm so proud of you, I whispered. That night, I didn't sleep at all, only watching the camera feed to my son's room. I had placed the lens facing his bed and closed off the window just in case. Nothing happened for hours until I did something so simple, something I would regret for the rest of my life. I went to the kitchen for a glass of water. I was gone no more than 20 seconds when I heard him.
Dad!
Ben screamed, making me drop the glass. I watched as it shattered onto the kitchen floor.
Ben!
I screamed, rushing to his bedroom.
Ben, hang on!
I shouted again, now just outside his room. When I burst through the door, I felt my heart stop. My son's bed was empty, and he was gone.
Ben! Ben!
I screamed, searching frantically for him. The window was still boarded off and sealed, yet my son was gone nonetheless. The police never found him, and I could tell from how the detective in charge eyed me over that I was their main suspect. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that I found Ben's drawings from the previous months. There were no dead children outside the window, and no monsters with black eyes. There was something else entirely. Please, if you ever see the black-eyed children outside your window, please, God, don't make the same mistake I did. They aren't monsters. I think they were trying to warn us. As I sit today and stare out the window, I tell myself that maybe, just maybe, I'll find my son again one day. I have to think that. It's the only thing that keeps me alive. I glance down at my son's notebook from months earlier. One page stands out among the rest. There is a drawing of his room, the window boarded off, and my son sleeping peacefully. The closet door is cracked open, and a large clawed hand can be seen reaching through towards his bed.